Look what we got. This is cool. This is the newest GM Performance Parts crate engine. The guys over at GM noticed that the 5.3 liter V8s are some of the hottest things going on the streets these days. Guys are building them for dirt cheap and making tons of power, and so GM made their own. This is a brand new, completely new components crate engine. It is called the LS327. It's so new you won't even find it on GM's website, even though it is in the 2008 catalog. The part numbers are kind of difficult to find. Some dealers call this the HO 5.3. Other places you'll see it's an LS327. Basically, it's an LM7 engine, which is like 99 to 2006 GM truck. But GM Performance Parts has put an LS1 camshaft in it and coated pistons, and it's supposed to make 327 horsepower and about 350 foot-pounds of torque. But we're gonna go find out as we load this thing on the dyno out at West Tech Performance. When we first thought about testing the crate engine, our temptation, of course, was to set it on kill and make a ton of power with it. But my thought for the first stages here is that anyone who buys a brand new crate engine probably wants to retain the warranty and doesn't want to get into tearing into parts that are inside. So we left the stock cam and stock heads for this test. However, when you get the crate engine, it's just a long block, and so you're going to have to choose an intake manifold and a carburetor, and in this video, we're going to tell you which one works best. We're ready for stage one on the dyno, and the way we set the engine up was with a GM single plane intake, a Holley 670 carb, and a set of Corvette headers which are meant for a late model application, undercar long tubes. I think they're 1 3/4 inch with a 3-inch collector. The first thing that we ran into when we started to test the engine is that it didn't want to buzz past 6,000 RPM. It would hit valve float. And it turns out that some earlier motors that have been tested at West Tech did the same thing. So I called my insiders at GM, said, what's the deal? As it turns out, this engine, which is essentially a truck motor, is validated on their dyno with a truck intake manifold, which is done at like 57 or 5800 RPM. So if you're gonna wing it higher than that with a carb intake, you're gonna have to have different valve springs. We installed some Comp Cam's beehives there at West Tech, but another choice would be to install some of the GM Performance Parts LS6 offerings. After step one, we were seeing pretty much what GM advertises. We were making 340 pound-feet at 4,700 RPM and 346 horsepower at 6,100, but I'm pretty sure we can do better, and here's how. Next up, the Edelbrock dual-plane intake manifold, and I bet you we see a big kick in the torque curve. Now we've got power numbers for stage two, which was with the 670 carb and the dual plane intake. We made 360 pound-feet at 3,900 RPM and 337 horsepower at 5,600. Now there's a couple of things to check out here when we compare the power production of the dual plane to the single plane. First of all, look how peak power is at a lower RPM at 5,600. If you run the dual plane, you might not need to change the valve springs like we were talking about earlier, because you're just not going to get to that RPM. Now the downside is, of course, you're making less horsepower with the dual plane, but look at the kick in the torque curve. Not only did it move the torque peak down to 3,900 RPM from 4,700, but it's even making more torque than the single plane once we get up to 4,700. For the street, you're definitely going to want to pick that Edelbrock dual plane.
So it's magic?
It's magic.
Bigger carburetor made more power. It's magic.
The other thing that we did here is compared two different carburetors on both intake manifolds. The first carburetor was a Holley 670 CFM vacuum secondary, which is the Street Avenger line. The second carburetor was the Holley 750 Street HP. The 750 is a little bit more of a performance-minded carburetor and doesn't have a choke horn on it. When we ran these two carbs back to back, we found that the 750 always made just a little bit more power. It wasn't pulling as much vacuum up at the high RPM range as we saw with the 670, which actually had about 2 inches of manifold vacuum at RPM. So the ultimate conclusion is if you're going to leave the engine basically stock, that 670 Street Avenger will work, especially if it's really a street car application. But if you ever decide to upgrade the engine in order to make more power, you might as well go directly to the 750 to begin with. And both of those carburetors are sold through GM Performance Parts.
Look the same to me.
It doesn't care.
No.
The last thing that we did is another one of the easiest induction mods that you can do, which is we tested a bunch of carburetor spacers. These are all from Wilson manifolds, and they're in various designs from open to tapered to 4-hole. And basically none of them made any difference on the dyno, except for the 4-hole, which actually created some weird problems. You might find in a car that you'll get different throttle response issues, different 60-foot times with some of these spacers, but on the dyno, we really didn't see anything. At the end of our dyno session, the very best pull was with the Holley 750 HP carburetor, no spacer at all, and the Edelbrock dual plane intake manifold. We were making 362 pound-feet of torque from 3,800 to 4,000 RPM and 341 horsepower, which had a big range from 5,500 all the way to about 6,000. Now that's pretty good power for an engine you can build top to bottom for $4,200 as seen here. The long block itself sells for around $3,100 from GM Performance Parts dealers. And of course, there's a lot of things that you can do to these by pulling an engine out of a junkyard and making similar power. But you might want to consider the GM crate engine because, first of all, it's all brand new parts. Also, before they can sell a crate engine through GM, it has to go through this torture test where they run it at wide open throttle between peak torque and peak horsepower for 24 hours, just beating on the thing. And that lets them give a warranty of 2 years or 50,000 miles. Now the next thing that we're going to do is throw this engine in a car, which is going to be a surprise, and completely void the warranty, probably running some nitrous through it. We're going to make a bunch of other hop-ups, and you can look for that over the next few months on Suck, Squeeze, Bang, Blow.